The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the first chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." And the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. Now after John was arrested, Jesus came to Galilee, proclaiming the good news of God and saying, "The time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news." The Gospel of the Lord. So I spent quite a bit of last week at a continuing education event in Colorado. And if you are privy to my Facebook feed, you would have thought all I did was ski, because that's all the pictures that I posted were the pictures of me skiing. But there were about 50 mostly Lutheran pastors that gathered there for this continuing education event that we had with a couple of professors that were brought in from Luther Seminary. And we did actually go to class, before the lifts opened and after they closed, because that's how they designed the event. We had an hour of class before the lifts opened, and then we had 3 hours of class after the lifts closed. And we had some really interesting discussions, and some really neat ideas were shared with us during that time. It wasn't all just the skiing. And maybe because Lent was approaching, one of the professors from Luther Seminary asked us to consider today's gospel reading from Mark, the shortest of the stories that we often call the temptation of Jesus. Except that in Mark's version of the story, the temptations of Satan are not narrated at all. In fact, it just seems like it's another one of those things that happens to Jesus while he happens to be out in the wilderness. So he's in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, and oh yeah, Satan tempted him, and oh yeah, he was with the wild beasts, and oh yeah, the angels waited on him, but there's no narration of that. So it's a very short piece of the story. And so the question that the professor put to us was, he said, why would the Spirit drive Jesus into the wilderness immediately following his baptism? Why the wilderness? Because the Spirit drove him there, so it clearly was part of God's plan. And why there? So while I was skiing, I did think about that for a little bit. And, I wondered why. Why the wilderness? Because following Jesus' baptism, it doesn't say that Jesus was put into the wilderness for any particular reason. It's not in order that he could fast, in order that he could pray, in order that he could be tempted by Satan. It was just the wilderness. So why? After all, he had just heard the voice from heaven that declared him to be God's beloved Son. And that is pretty cool. So if you're declared to be God's beloved child, what's the first thing you would do? Well, maybe have a nice party to celebrate. After all, that's what we do in baptisms, right? So as soon as somebody is baptized, we usually have a cake, and we go out to lunch, and we have a party, and we celebrate. That's a really great thing to do. Why the wilderness? Or maybe Jesus should get to work immediately. He's been fully credentialed now as God's representative. Go out and start preaching and healing and doing all these kinds of things. Why the wilderness? And maybe, at least, Jesus should go where he's going to be around some people. The people that God sent him to save. Why the wilderness? So, somehow or other, the wilderness was important. And it was the place where the Spirit drove Jesus immediately following his baptism. An uncomfortable, lonely, and dangerous place. And after all, this seems to be where Jesus needs to be, because that's where the Spirit drives him. So, why is that? Well, it seems to me that, among many other reasons that possibly could be there, perhaps the Spirit drove Jesus into the wilderness to give Jesus the opportunity to demonstrate God's commitment to being in places where nobody expected God to be. Because that was what people thought about wilderness in those days. I was skiing, the ski resort that we were skiing in is technically part of the wilderness area, it's part of the national forest. And we think of wilderness as a nice, relaxing, beautiful place to go. You relax, you unwind, you commune with nature, it's all wonderful, but that's not how people understood wilderness in Jesus' day. Wilderness was not only the haunt of wild animals, it was the haunt of demons. It was the place where God was not. If you went into the wilderness, you were going far, far away from where God was. Why does Jesus go there? Well, maybe it's to demonstrate, even from the very beginning, what Jesus is going to do. He is always going to show up in places and among people where folks think God has forgotten about these people. God has forgotten about this place. God has abandoned us. And when Jesus shows up, he shows that God has not forgotten, that God has not abandoned him. And from the very beginning, the Spirit drives Jesus into the wilderness to demonstrate that God is not going to be kept out of any place or from any person who feels that they've been abandoned or neglected by God. Maybe the Spirit drives Jesus into the wilderness so that Jesus has the ability to practice and to demonstrate relying on God. See, being in the wilderness is a lonely and dangerous place, and you cannot control stuff out there. And while it says the angels waited on him, I don't think that means they made his life easy for him. It's a really bad idea if you're picturing this and you're thinking that Jesus is sitting on a nice sofa in the middle of the desert while one angel fans him and the other angel puts grapes in his mouth. And, oh, it's really nice. All that's really happening is that the angels are there to make sure that Jesus has what he absolutely needs to survive the experience. And, in Matthew and Luke's version of this, Jesus handles Satan pretty well by himself. I'd like the angels around to beat off some of the wild beasts, because they're going to try to eat you out there. Somehow or other, Jesus went in and was driven into the wilderness by the Spirit so that he could actually have the experience and demonstrate that he was going in his ministry to rely on God's power and to trust in God's presence to give him what he needed instead of trying to control the situation with his own human abilities. Maybe that's why the Spirit drove him into the wilderness. And maybe the Spirit drove him into the wilderness so that he could have an opportunity to focus on God before he began his ministry with everybody else. That was, after all, why people went into solitary places, so that they could pray and listen and focus on God. And Jesus did that other times in his life when he went out to a lonely place to pray, it says, but wilderness, that's really rather kind of extreme. And yet, in doing so, Jesus is in a place where he can clear out all the other clutter and all the other chaos and confusion that's going to surround all of the rest of his ministry, so that he has the bandwidth to listen for and to pray to God. And of course, when you clear out bandwidth in your life, Satan can hack in and start the temptation, which is probably how Mark wants us to understand this. There are people who go through, you go through these meditative exercises where they say, be quiet, close your eyes, listen to your breath, clear your mind of everything, and so that there's nothing in your mind. It never works for me. The reason it never works for me, I know it works for a lot of people, but it doesn't work for me because as soon as I push something out of my mind, something else jumps in there. And, and I think that part of the temptation here in Mark's Gospel is that as soon as you really clear out and say, okay, I don't have to think about anything, there's this voice that goes, oh, so, now that you're not thinking about anything, want to do this. But that bandwidth is important, because without it, you can't listen for God. You can't be open to what God's saying to you in your life, what God's calling you to do. And from the very beginning, the Spirit drives Jesus into the wilderness in order that he's able to have that kind of bandwidth, practice setting aside that kind of time and that kind of space so that God can be at the center of what's happening in his ministry. So Lent, for us, is often understood as a time of return to our baptism. That is, baptism is our incorporation into the life and the death of Jesus. It is our time of considering how we follow in Jesus' baptism to the cross and to the empty tomb. And so during Lent, that therefore begs the question, the Spirit driving us in our baptisms? And maybe for us too, the Spirit is driving us, like Jesus, to be God's presence in the places where people do not expect God to be. That is, each of us in our baptism is called to be the physical expression of God in the life and in the places, in the lives of others, where folks say, you know what, if there is a God, I don't see where God is. And that may be you. That may be me. That may simply be opening yourself up to crossing the boundary into some other part of somebody else's wilderness. And there's a lot of wilderness in our world right now. There are a lot of places that, without having to look very far, feel like this is the haunt of demons. These are places where people are sitting lonely and afraid and without any kind of hope. Those are the wilderness places in our collective lives and sometimes in people's personal lives. And even as, Mark doesn't narrate the temptations of Satan in this story, he also doesn't narrate any dramatic thing that Jesus did while he was in the wilderness, except that he was there. And sometimes the most important thing that we can do, and that we're being called to do and driven to do by the Spirit, is simply to be there in somebody else's life. To sit with them in their own personal wilderness and be there for them. To pick up one of the bags, fill it up with things so that when somebody gets it, they go, you know what, I'm not forgotten. I'm not alone. God answered my prayer through that. So that somehow or other, we make the presence of God a physical, known reality in the life of somebody who feels like they're sitting in the wilderness. Maybe for us too, like Jesus, the Spirit is driving us to practice relying on God. And that seems really simple and easy, but especially if you're kind of a control freak like me, that's really the hardest part of the program. Because so often, when life around us feels like a wilderness, when things seem to be really spinning out of control, the natural reaction is to want to draw a little circle around myself and around the people I love and go, this piece, at least I can control, and it's not going to be the wilderness. I'm going to be safe. I'm going to be secure. The people I love are going to be safe and secure, and I'm not going to have to worry about anything happening bad to me. Sometimes, though, that's just retreating into a false sense of security. And what people are called to do over and over again in their baptism is to let go of some of the things that we cling to so tightly to try to control our lives and the world around us so that we can rely on God. And relying on God doesn't mean nothing bad will happen to you. The email that comes out every week, and Judy calls me this week and she says, this same verse, this same set of verses has been used like 5 times already in the last 4 months, or 2 months or something like that, because Mark doesn't narrate anything with it. And so we keep reading the beginning of the story over and over and over again. Spoiler alert, at the end of the story, Jesus gets killed. And he gets killed because he is following God's will. And he is doing what God asks him to do, and because he does ultimately rely on God. So relying on God isn't just, somehow or other, everything will be all right if I trust God. But it is the ability to say, I have a deeper sense of the transcendence of God in my life, who is going to get me through the wildernesses that I have to walk through, who's going to sustain me and somehow help me, especially when I cannot control the world around me. So some of the things that are traditional Lenten disciplines that also are not narrated in the story in Mark's Gospel never says that Jesus fasted. I'm sure he did because there was no food out there. But sometimes giving up food, giving alms, giving money to somebody else is certainly it's there to help other people. That's one of its primary goals. But it's also there spiritually to help us to say so much of my personal sense of security is I have way more food in my house than I ever need, and I have lots of comfort food. That's how I have my sense of security. And I have more money than I need to have right now, but I want to hold on tight to it just in case. And that gives me my own sense of personal security. if I'm able to actually give some of that up and give some of that away, it helps me loosen my grip on controlling things myself so that I can be able to then trust God to get me through. And I start to realize that, you know what? I actually could live with a little less money. And I could actually live with a little less food. And when you start to do that, you start to realize God really is getting me through this. Sometimes that is where the Spirit is driving us in our baptism as well. And sometimes for us too, the Spirit is driving us, like Jesus, to be people who really spend time focusing on God. That is actually carving out bandwidth in our lives to listen for the voice of God, to listen for the guidance of God. And that can be really, really hard in the lives of so many of us where everything is constantly coming at us 24/7. We never have time to sit and think and reflect. And then we don't have the bandwidth to listen for God. And some of the times that people have talked to me about, this is how you set time aside. You go into your room, you close the door, you turn off everything, you just be quiet for a few hours and just meditate and clear your mind. Like I said, that, for introverts, that is heaven. And that's a good thing to do if you're an introvert. For extroverts, that's hell. So you're like, I need stuff to do. And so there's a variety of ways to open up that bandwidth in your life. And some of it is setting aside to be quiet, listen, to read, but some of it is getting together with other people for worship, to discuss things. One of the things that's interesting about the labyrinth exercise, if you've ever done any of those kinds of things, is it's not a sit there, it's an actual movement, and Pastor Christine has a bunch of exercises that you do. As you walk through this, you're actually moving your body as a way of focusing yourself on listening for God. All kinds of activities and things that you can do, but opening up that bandwidth in your life is really important if you're going to actually have a kind of connection to God that helps you to trust God to live through that wilderness experience. And sometimes what God is doing all the time, what the Spirit is always doing in our lives, is calling us to take and try and experiment with ways to open up some bandwidth so that we can really hear the voice of God speaking to us. So in this year's Lenten journey, pay attention to where the Spirit is driving you in your baptism. Use these 40 days to be renewed in your relationship with God. And be open to the possibility that, like Jesus, the Spirit may be driving you to be God's physical presence in a place or with a person who really needs it. Be open to the possibility that, like Jesus, the Spirit may be driving you to let go of some things that you cling so tightly to for your own sense of security, so that you can practice trusting and relying on God. And be open to the possibility that the Spirit may also be driving you, like Jesus, to be at a place where you can really open up and focus and provide bandwidth to listen to God, so that long after these 40 days are over, you can be more fully God's instrument in the life of the world.